As a sports fan, I have to confess. Sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there's one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
Hello everyone, this is Fortune's Wheel and I am your host Jonathan, and today we are continuing our first Patreon series called Poland Finds Its Place. I want to sincerely thank you all who are listening to this, as you've generously donated to the production of this podcast and shown that you believe in what's happening here. There are no words for my appreciation, so I'll simply offer another heartfelt thank you. So, back to our first members-only series, and we will actually be wrapping it up on this episode. This is episode 7, entitled Poland Remains. I hope you enjoyed the show. Adam Zamoyski writes, quote, "To be specific about Poland at this time is not easy," end quote. This time being the late 11th century, that is. He continues, quote, "Frontiers fluctuated and great expanses of land, particularly in Pomerania, were considered to be Polish by the ruler of Poland, and to be German by the emperor. Every so often, one monarch or another would appear at the head of an army to restate his claim, but no such thing as a permanent boundary existed, and the fact that the population was Slav did not count either way. There were also a great many foreigners settled in the cities, mainly German and Jews from Western Europe. Nevertheless, by the year 1100, there was a fairly well-defined area inhabited by about 2 million racially and linguistically homogeneous people, which can be defined as Poland, even though it did not necessarily correspond to political frontiers. Provinces such as Silesia, which were lost to Poland for several hundred years, retained into the 20th century their consciousness of being a limb of the Polish body." End quote. So that was quite a quote to kickstart the episode with. I know. I encourage you to rewind the episode and listen to it again if you need to. Truth be told, I must have read that passage at least 4 times myself. But I do feel like it's packed with a good summation of where Poland found itself, its national identity, if I may use such a term, around the 11th century. It had been one hell of a century for the Polish. Just one generation removed from being a somewhat isolated super tribe on the fertile central lowlands between the Vorta and Vistula rivers. They had burst onto the scene as a powerful duchy early on in the 11th century. Then, out of nowhere, its duke named himself king. But after his son lacked the leadership abilities to hold the kingdom together, Poland, as it was, fell into a dark time of loss and absent identity altogether, as they were led by buffoons, essentially. They were invaded and ultimately subdued into a subservient duchy once again. But at that point, they'd already consolidated a lot of land outside of their original territories and made political and cultural and economic inroads with leading powers outside of their borders, including Germany, Hungary, Denmark, and Kiev. And after a generation of restoration, we find ourselves at another crossroads. Well, it's once again a kingdom. When seen from this bird's eye view, Poland ran the gamut over the preceding 100 years. Now, culturally, Poland found itself changing its own face, one could say. It had been Christianized under Mieszko I, about 100 or more years earlier. However, its religious landscape, though make no mistake, they were still overwhelmingly pagan and Christian, began shifting ever so subtly. Due to an upsurge in anti-Semitic language and violence around Europe and the Middle East at the time, especially with shifting landscapes in Iberia, with the more tolerant Umayyad dynasty casting off high-ranking Jews in droves over the previous several decades, well, Jews were having a hard time finding new places to go. And in the mid to late 11th century, we see a growing number of Jews crossing the Carpathian Mountains and settling into these new economic centers throughout Poland. They brought with them a wealth of not only, wealth, but also knowledge of how to create and deal in wealth and business. And this isn't some backwards rant about stereotypes of Jewish people either. I'm completely aware of the line I'm walking there, but we have to remember where these folks came from. On the main podcast, we've been learning about Iberia under Umayyad leadership, as well as after the Umayyad collapse, and there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews who lived in those cities, who held extremely high places and high offices. They were largely all literate in Hebrew and Arabic, and probably one other language such as Latin for translation purposes. And when Iberia became more and more Christian, well, the Christians didn't quite appreciate their Jewish friends' talents and know-how. So they had no choice, many of them, but to find other places to live. Take their skills elsewhere, out of Iberia. There was an upsurge, as I said, in anti-Semitic violence in France and Germany during the 11th century, as well as a ramping up of emotions between Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land. Jews, seems to be the case always, being caught in the crossfire during those same decades. I think we can pretty much say that about 90% of history, but it was a tough time to be a Jew in the 11th century. And almost like a heart's pulse, small waves of Jews made their way into Poland toward the close of the century. Lucky for them, the resentment hadn't built up in Poland. Not yet. So, as Zamoyski wrote, Poland was, quote, a fairly well-defined area inhabited by about 2 million racially and linguistically homogeneous people, end quote. Though we can't forget about its changing landscape, as we discussed. There was a clear sense of what being Polish looked like, sounded like, and even felt like. Zamoyski writes, quote, this sense of nationhood, more marked in Poland at this stage than in France, England, and most of the other future states of Europe, was not the result of the mere century and a half since Christianization. A sense of unity was in evidence much earlier, end quote. And he gives this credit to Mieszko I's incredible leadership and his moves to make the term Polish less cultural and more political. And that's a key point to make. Less cultural and more political. Polish, Poland. These two terms became part of the European political landscape, forcing outsiders to know them, to use the terms, and even sometimes contend with them. Poland was on the move, and from Mieszko I to our current king, Władysław Herman, in 1079, economic development had actually been the front and center thing on the docket, instead of territorial expansion, which might come as a surprise. Zamoyski says, quote, they had established over 80 castle towns by the end of the 11th century, and endowed market towns with royal charters granting rights and protections. They encouraged the replacement of barter with their own coinage, and did what they could to ensure the security necessary for the development of international trade routes throughout the country." End quote. Now, these markets and churches and other buildings of note, it's worth noting, were predominantly made of wood, unlike places around Europe, as stone of building quality was very rare in Poland. So any stone had to be imported, which, as you can imagine, was quite expensive, just not worth it at all levels of society. However, as Poland's European stock rose as the 11th century came to a close, churches and castles began making the switch to stone, and the craftsmanship began to shift as well. See, earlier in the century, Germans and Burgundians came to Poland at Otto's request and gave their buildings a bit of their own flair, but after a couple generations of Polish architects learning the discipline and coming into their own, well, Poland began offering its own flavor to the European gumbo of architectural styles. And it wasn't just architecture that gave Poland a fresh way to spread its identity and its values. The church itself began embracing Polish artisans and craftsmen, and they became big cheerleaders for such opulent decorations that began to be carved and created throughout the next century. Ironic, too, considering the Benedictine order moved into the duchy/kingdom/duchy or whatever sometime after 1050. Zamoyski reports that churches began building schools attached to them, which offered an outlet, almost like tapping into the collective internet and being able to exchange information across vast distances in the form of sending Polish students to other countries, learn all they could, and then return to enrich their own culture. This mini sort of globalization facilitated massive change throughout the next century and beyond. In fact, as Zamoyski writes, quote, "Between 1112 and 1116, the first Polish chronicle, a Latin text of some literary quality, was written down in Krakow by Gallus Anonymous, probably a Benedictine monk from Provence." End quote. So it was, by around 1079, as we said, when Duke Boleslav II the Bold proclaimed himself King of Poland, only to die in exile, his son Vladislav Herman taking the reins as Duke instead of King. But once again, that was the only option left to the successor. In fact, just to be clear on this, we shouldn't expect another Polish king for quite some time. It wouldn't be until 1295, some 216 years after Boleslav II was booted from the position. Now, during this time, though Poland would be ruled by a series of dukes, Poland itself would continue to, well, for lack of a better word, flourish. The next 2 centuries would be a time of some pretty massive growth, economically, politically, and especially culturally, so stay tuned on that one. As for Duke Vladislav Herman taking over from a disgraced father, but as much as he tried to do for Poland, and he did do a considerable amount of building and restructuring to get Poland back up and running, in doing so, well, he quickly found himself in the pocket of a wealthy Polish statesman named, I'm going to try to get this right, Ciesiek, someone you might loosely compare to a Earl Godwin back in England. This Ciesiek guy, he eventually wielded a considerable amount of power and was able to direct much of the wealth and influence around the duchy, despite what his duke said or even thought. Ciesiek's luck would eventually run out when, in 1101, with the help of Vladislav's 2 sons, Boleslav Wrymouth and Zbigniew, he was forcefully and violently exiled. And seriously, Ciesiek was no slouch, though. In fact, at one point, he militarily moved on Gdansk and took it as his own in 1090. Now, after that, he had the audacity to mint his own coins even. And if you didn't agree with him, he'd probably sell your family into slavery, only to blind and torture you until a merciful death saved you. The guy was pretty brutal. Okay, so Poland, even with the near coup by Ciesiek, found itself growing and changing, but more or less all for the positive. The national identity, as we mentioned earlier, was solidifying, despite the influx of Germans and Jews and Burgundians spilling into its territories. The way they saw It was that if you were willing to chance fate in Poland as an outsider, and as long as you followed the customs and laws of the land, then you too were Polish. Well, kind of. How about Polish enough? But when Władysław Herman died in 1102, Poland was split between his two sons. Ugh, not again. Okay, well, yeah, technically that happened, but at least it wasn't a literal breakup. It was kind of strange, actually. Poland was still whole, but it was ruled by two different people, broken up into two different regions. Like I said, strange. It was kind of like if just going off the U.S.'s last election here, nothing more, so don't take any offense to what I'm about to say, just a thought experiment. But it'd be like Joe Biden ruling over just the blue states and Donald Trump ruling over just the red states. But the country was still connected by the Constitution. They shared in the successes and failures of each other, but they gave their allegiances to two different people. Yeah, that could work, right? Right. So the two fellows in question here, Władysław Herman's two sons, were, again, Boleslav Wrymouth and a man named Zbigniew. But there was a very interesting dynamic happening there. See, Boleslav Wrymouth was technically the real heir to his father's duchy, and Zbigniew was considered Władysław Herman's bastard son from his first marriage, destined for either a life in a monastery or a knighthood at very best. Except that when the whole situation with Cieszek occurred, it was the Silesians who brought Zbigniew back from Germany to assist ousting the overzealous magnate. Well, they actually kidnapped him from where he was in Quedlinburg, actually, but that's beside the point. Władysław Herman saw this as a direct threat to his rule, at first anyway. But in some weird twist of circumstance, Poland was eventually split among the three men first. Władysław Herman maintained Masovia, including the cities of Plock, Wrocław, and Krakow. Zbigniew, the northern lands, including Pomerania, which included Gdansk and Gniezno. And Boleslav Wrymouth got Silesia, the mountainous plateau to the south, and basically from the Bug River south. And when Cieszek and Władysław Herman's second wife, Judith's, conspiracy to seize power was discovered, well, this plot drew the two half-brothers together, and an alliance between them was formed. Judith was dealt with, and Cieszek, as I said, was violently exiled. Now, after Dad's death, though, on June 4th, 1102, Zbigniew, the eldest of the sons, ruled over northern Poland, as I said, while Boleslav Wrymouth took over the entire southern half. But Boleslav Wrymouth, just like any younger brother, coveted his older brother's things, and he declared his intentions to take Pomerania, which included, again, the very important port city of Gdansk on the Baltic Sea. The older Zbigniew at first just slapped his little brother's hand and shooed him away, but Boleslav Wrymouth wasn't going to be easily deterred. He pressed the matter, and he pressed the matter further until Zbigniew pulled the older brother card and declared himself the elder brother and therefore the rightful heir to his father's duchy, which legally was not the case. This naturally ticked Boleslav Wrymouth off to no end, a blemish on his honor, no doubt, and he pressed into Pomerania, forcing a violent reaction. Zbigniew was ousted in 1106 after 3 or 4 years of infighting, a civil war really, if you will, and he fled to Germany for safe harbor. But by 1109, he was able to convince Emperor Henry V to invade Poland and install him as the sole duke of all of Poland once and for all. But, and boy, you got to give credit to the Poles for not taking any German crap during the 11th century, because we find yet another German king/Holy Roman Emperor humiliated on Polish soil at the Battle of Głogów. Zbigniew was captured at the battle, and Boleslav Wrymouth blinded his own brother as retribution for rising up against him, thus rendering Zbigniew helpless. He kind of falls into obscurity at that point. Between the years of 1102 and 1107, all manner of foreign mercenaries and armies were sucked into the affair between Zbigniew and Boleslav Wrymouth. From Germany and Bohemia to Hungary and Kiev, each brother used whoever they could pay to gain the upper hand. And it was Boleslav Wrymouth who gained the ultimate upper hand and won the affair. Now, with Boleslav Wrymouth in sole control of the Duchy of Poland in 1107, he wasted no time in seeking a little retribution. Each ruler needs to make his or her mark upon the principality they're ruling, regardless of how large or small their territory is or was. And Boleslav was no different. But enemies once pacified can storm back with a vengeance if you're not careful. In 1108, Duke Boleslav Wrymouth invaded Bohemia as a preemptive strike against Poland's trusted ally, Hungary. See, Germany and Bohemia were set to attack Hungary as not only a punishment for backing Boleslav Wrymouth, but also as a way to weaken the Polish duke's power and support. Holy Roman Emperor Henry V didn't exactly take the news of the Bohemian raid too kindly, and he mustered those same German Bohemian forces and turned them in the direction of Poland instead of Hungary. So if you remember just a couple minutes ago, we learned that, Zbigniew came back with Germany's help. This is kind of the backstory of that. Henry V demanded Boleslav Wrymouth commit half of Poland to Zbigniew once again, as well as a boatload of wealth and knights to serve the emperor. Naturally, Boleslav Wrymouth was a stubborn and obstinate man and flatly refused the emperor, and once again, Silesia was caught in the crosshairs, being ground zero for what became known as the Poland-German War of 1109. Now, there will be many of these, as there already have been, so just make sure that all these Polish-German wars have a year attached so you can follow along at home. Now, within the year, Henry V and his ally were repelled, which freed Boleslav Wrymouth for an attempt on Bohemia. A serious one this time, not a half-hearted raid, but a real invasion. Oh, wait, no. After a resounding victory over the Bohemian rivals at Trutina in October of 1110, he decided against pushing the campaign for inexplicable reasons and returned to Poland. There, he negotiated peace terms, and one of them was for Zbigniew to be returned to Poland. The flip side of that being agreed to was that Zbigniew would return to his own land and title. Seems legit, but things quickly went bad when supporters of Zbigniew urged him on to his claim to reclaim ownership over Pomerania and his original territory, to which Boleslav Wrymouth rolled his eyes before removing his brothers in 1112. So that's really fleshing out that story we just heard. This made Boleslav Wrymouth, already a tough man to deal with, quite unpopular with his countrymen. However, it still ensured that he was the undisputed Duke of Poland. Period. And he would earn back the lost respect and loyalty in due time, but this is where we stop Wrymouth's reign. Now, don't worry, he will reign for quite some time longer, and we will pick up his story, most likely on the public podcast episode sometime in the future. Now, I really hope you've enjoyed this stroll through Poland's long and winding 11th century. Man, it's been a rough one, but it's been infinitely fascinating to see the birth and the first few steps of this soon-to-be medieval juggernaut. But before we call this first Patreon series a wrap, I want to explain to you why you may not hear much about Poland on the public podcast concerning the Crusades. Well, the Crusades are officially announced in 1095, and with the exception of a debacle led by Peter the Hermit, the official First Crusade, behind the likes of, giants like Bohemond of Taranto, Count Raymond of Toulouse, Count Hugh of Vermandois, and Godfrey of Bouillon, just such unbelievably towering figures of that period. I can't wait to kind of flesh it out. Well, that one began in 1099 and ended around 1098 and ended around 1099. Now, as we've heard, Poland's 1090s and 1100s were 2 decades of near chaos and succession crises and infighting and civil wars, all that. Poland was receiving many of the displaced folks who fled the Crusaders. With all of that going on, Poland, more or less, sat the First Crusades out altogether. You know what? Let's just let Adam Zamoyski explain his thoughts on why Poland wasn't too eager to join the armies heading south to the Holy Land. He says, quote, "A major motor in propelling great numbers of European knights across the seas to fight crusades in Palestine and the Baltic later, and settlers to follow them, by the way, was the great population explosion of the Middle Ages, which produced serious overcrowding. The still underpopulated Poland felt no such need for expansion and tolerated the large-scale immigration of Jews, Bohemians, and Germans who provided useful services. The feelings toward Jews and the quote-unquote infidels in general were less violent in a country which was still a newcomer to Christianity and which viewed the empire and the papacy with considerable mistrust. End quote.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
With the Walmart app, you can squeeze in those final days of summer and nail that back-to-school shopping list. So keep working on that tan and let Walmart Express Delivery handle the rest. Chromebooks, Clorox wipes, Sharpies, glue sticks, pens, pencils, and more. All delivered in as fast as an hour. So pour yourself another iced tea. Summer's not over. Last-minute back-to-school supplies delivered fast. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new. Subject to availability. Fees and restrictions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
Now, Zamoyski mentions a little about Poland being that quote-unquote so new to Christianity, that in and of itself having a major impact on how they approach the people of other faiths, such as Jews, for instance. He says, quote, pagan cults survived the official conversion of the country in 966, and the next 2 centuries witnessed several major revivals, during which churches were burnt and priests put to death. The pagan survivals were particularly strong in areas such as Pomerania, which were attempting to maintain a measure of autonomy in the face of pressure to submit to either Polish or imperial overlordship. Now, until the 1120s, there was a much visited shrine of the god, oh my gosh, I can't even begin to pronounce it, Terzglava in Szczecin. I'm telling you, I'm so sorry, Polish listeners. A grandiose temple covered in frescoes, housing a live black horse, which was consulted as an oracle. End quote. And believe it or not, after all I've studied and learned about the Middle Ages thus so far in the podcast, I'm not even bothered by the whole horse as oracle thing. I've kind of become desensitized. Not sure if that's healthy or not, but let's just move on. Now, the quote before the last one about the horse, I'd like to return to it. In its last sentence, I'd like to repeat at least a part of it, and then tie it in with Zamoyski's very next sentence. Here we go. He says, quote, which viewed the empire, this is the Polish, which viewed the empire and the papacy with considerable mistrust. It could almost be said that the Poles have come to view all higher authority with mistrust. End quote. Now, between Christians only a couple or a few generations removed from Christian conversion, to the survival of the old pagan ways, and from the survival of pagan temples and practices, all the way to the influx of outsiders like Jews, Poland kind of just took the approach of leaving religious matters to each community, it seems like. They didn't exactly jump into the zealotry that had pervaded other Christian and Muslim principalities over the previous centuries. Zamoyski continues, quote, the church could do little about this in the face of a general lack of zeal, which is well illustrated by the Polish response to Rome's summons to the Crusades. Apart from Prince Henryk of Sandomierz, few heeded it. Duke Leszek the White explained in a long letter to the Pope that neither he nor any self-respecting Polish knight could be induced to go to the Holy Land, where they had been informed there was no wine, mead, or even beer to be had. End quote. Okay, I get the impulse. No beer? Really? Gotta love the Polish for that and that alone, but it certainly went deeper than beer. Poland seemed to have evolved as a place for outsiders, as regardless of how it tried to maintain its independence and autonomy on the European stage, it repeatedly was subdued and made to be a vassal. But the grassroots folks, the ground pounders and farmers, and the real engine of the duchy, most likely you and me, had we been born in Poland around that time, see, they maintained that fierce autonomy and respected it in others as well. Poland's not perfect. Nowhere was or is perfect. But Poland's place in the late 11th century and its first steps into the 12th century, well, Poland had carved out its own piece of the European puzzle. And it was a bold, lively, and fiercely independent place. Its tolerance was unrivaled throughout Christendom, and it wasn't keen to join in the latest fads, such as crusading, for instance. It was wise beyond its years, and this wisdom would lead it through many more ups and downs throughout the rest of the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, and into the modern world. It would eventually form a juggernaut alliance that would rival the biggest players on the medieval stage, and many would comment on the wonder that is Poland. In Poland, a historical sketch by Emma Buckheim, she says, quote, "We may add that the Poland of the 15th century was one of the most civilized states of Europe." End quote. The great 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said in one of his rare lucid and joyful moments, quote, "I am thankful for the heavens that in all my instincts I stood Polish." End quote. The great author Honor de Balzac once wrote a glowing remark, quote, "Poles offer mobility like that of the wind that blows over the immense plains and marches of Poland. Show a Pole a precipice, and he will leap headlong over it." End quote. As for the heart and soul of what it is to be Polish, I love the following three quotes. The first by author James Michener, quote, "No invader has ever conquered the heart of Poland, that spirit which is the inheritance of sons and daughters, the private passion of families, and the ancient, unbreakable tie to all those who came before." End quote. Jeffrey Blaney describes the continuous flux Poland has endured over the last 1,000 years when he says, quote, "Poland is like an island on the North European plain. At times, the island has been swamped by a tide of iron or steel helmets converging from Germany and Russia. At times, it has drifted suddenly with the current. If the continent of Africa had drifted relatively as much as the boundaries of Poland have drifted in the last 200 years, then Africa would at one time touch the North Pole and at another the South." End quote. And this just goes to illuminate the elasticity of the Polish people to retain their identities through such cataclysmic upheavals. But very few things say better than the one and only Winston Churchill, who once spoke the following. He said, quote, "First, Poland has been again overrun by two of the greatest powers, which held her in bondage for 150 years, but were unable to quench the spirit of the Polish nation. The heroic defense of Warsaw shows that the soul of Poland is indestructible, and that she will rise again like a rock which may for a spell be submerged by a tidal wave, but which remains a rock." End quote. Man, you gotta love Winston Churchill. And where do you think all these folks' remarks came from? Did they just appear out of a void over the last 200 or 300 years? Of course not. Poland has been developing and evolving this attitude of boldness and tolerance and practicality and hardiness and fierce independence since the days of Mieszko I in the mid to late 900s. Their story, its first chapter one could say, begins almost 1100 years ago. And I dig that about Poland. And I dig that fierce independence and drive that you all have for not only learning something new each episode, but also for helping to make this show possible. Again, I just can't thank you enough. Tune in next month for our new series focusing on... you didn't think I'd actually let the cat out of the bag yet, did you? Stay tuned for that announcement soon on the regular podcast episodes, and I can't wait to keep learning and sharing what I know about our fascinating Middle Ages. Thank you for listening. Until next time.